The wind howls across frozen fields as the sun sets early over a small medieval village, and inside homes made of wood and mud, families gather close to dying embers, preparing for the long, cold months ahead. Tonight, we journey back 700 years to discover how ordinary people endured the harshest season without modern heating, grocery stores, or any of the comforts we take for granted today. This is a story of resilience, ingenuity, and the quiet determination of those who survived when survival itself was an achievement. Before we go back in time together, if you're enjoying settling in for the night with a bit of history, consider hitting subscribe. And I'm curious, where in the world are you listening from right now? And what time is it there? Drop it in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories travel. The landscape of medieval Europe transforms dramatically as autumn fades into winter, and the peasants who work the land must shift their entire way of living to match the rhythm of the cold. Imagine standing at the edge of a village in the year 1320, somewhere in the English countryside, watching as the last golden leaves fall from the oak trees and the sky takes on that heavy grey quality that promises snow. The air smells different now, sharper and cleaner, with a metallic edge that makes your lungs work harder with each breath. Smoke rises from every cottage chimney in thin grey columns that bend and twist in the wind before disappearing into the overcast sky above. The peasants have been preparing for this moment since the harvest ended in late September. Every decision made during the warmer months was calculated with winter survival in mind, because in the Middle Ages, winter was not merely uncomfortable but genuinely dangerous. Without proper preparation, families could starve, freeze, or succumb to illness before the spring thaw finally arrived. The stakes were absolute, and everyone in the village understood this truth from the time they could walk. Let us begin by understanding who these people were and what their lives looked like before the first frost arrived. A typical medieval village contains perhaps 30 to 50 families, most of them living in small one-room cottages clustered around a central commons and a stone church. The manor house, where the lord lives, sits slightly apart on higher ground, its walls thicker and windows shuttered with actual wooden panels rather than the oiled cloth that covers peasant windows. Between the cottages lie narrow dirt paths that turn to mud whenever it rains, and beyond the village proper stretch the open fields where peasants have spent the entire growing season cultivating wheat, barley, oats, and rye. These fields now lie harvested and bare, the stubble poking through increasingly hard soil as the temperature drops week by week. Peasant daily life during autumn revolves around gathering and preserving everything that might be needed once the deep cold arrives. Women and children walk the forest edges collecting fallen branches, acorns, and the last remaining berries. Men repair damaged tools, reinforce cottage walls with fresh daub, and slaughter animals that cannot be sustained through the lean months ahead. The rhythm of life in a medieval village follows the agricultural calendar with absolute precision, and everyone participates according to their age and ability. Children as young as 5 or 6 carry light loads of kindling, learning the skills they will need to survive as adults. Teenagers work alongside their parents in the fields and workshops, their bodies already accustomed to physical labour that would exhaust most modern people within hours. The elderly, no longer capable of heavy work, take on tasks like mending clothes, watching small children, and passing down the accumulated wisdom that makes survival possible. As October progresses into November, the tempo of activity intensifies. There is an urgency in every gesture, every conversation, every transaction at the village market. The peasants know what is coming because they have lived through it many times before, and each winter carries memories of hardship, loss, and the constant gnawing presence of cold that seeps into everything. The social structure of the village becomes even more apparent during the preparation season. The lord of the manor has the right to demand labour from his peasants, a system called corvée. but he also has a vested interest in their survival, since dead peasants cannot work his fields come spring. This creates a complex relationship where the Lord might allow access to the manor's resources in exchange for additional service, or grant permission to gather more wood from his forests than would normally be permitted. The village priest serves as both spiritual guide and practical advisor, his stone church offering a glimpse of what winter will be like for those without proper shelter. During services, peasants can feel the difference that thick stone walls make, how they hold the heat from dozens of gathered bodies and keep out the worst of the wind. The priest reminds his congregation that suffering in this life brings rewards in the next, but he also quietly shares information about which families might need extra help, which elderly villagers live alone, and which children show signs of the winter sickness that kills before spring arrives. Let the snow begin to fall, soft and silent at first, dusting the thatched roofs and collecting in the corners where walls meet ground, fortifying the home against the cold. The typical peasant cottage measures perhaps 15 feet by 20 feet, its walls built from a wooden frame filled with wattle and daub. Wattle consists of woven sticks, branches, and reeds that create a lattice structure between the timber posts. Daub is the mixture pressed into this lattice, a combination of clay, mud, straw, and animal dung that hardens into a surprisingly effective barrier against wind and weather. As winter approaches, every family inspects their walls for cracks, gaps, or places where the daub has crumbled away during the summer. Repairing these gaps becomes critical for medieval winter survival, because even small openings allow precious heat to escape and icy drafts to penetrate. The process of making fresh daub is unpleasant, but necessary. Clay must be dug from the riverbank and carried home in baskets, then mixed with straw from the recently harvested grain and dung from the family's animals. Children stomp the mixture with their bare feet, squishing the components together until they reach the right consistency, thick enough to cling to the wattle, but wet enough to push deep into the gaps. The smell of fresh daub is earthy and organic, not particularly offensive to people accustomed to living alongside animals. Once mixed, the daub must be applied by hand, pressed firmly into every crack and smoothed as flat as possible. As it dries over the following days, it shrinks slightly, sometimes requiring a second application to achieve a complete seal. The exterior walls receive the most attention, but interior walls also get repaired because maintaining even a few degrees of extra warmth can mean the difference between comfort and misery. The roof presents its own challenges. Thatched roofs made from bundled reeds or straw provide excellent insulation when properly maintained, but they require annual inspection and repair. Over the summer, wind and rain inevitably damage portions of the thatch, creating thin spots where cold air will penetrate once winter arrives. Replacing damaged sections requires skill, and most villages have one or two individuals who specialize in this work, trading their expertise for food, labor, or other goods. A well-maintained thatched roof can be remarkably effective at keeping out rain and snow while trapping warm air inside the cottage. The thick layer of bundled plant material creates countless tiny air pockets that act as natural insulation. When fresh snow falls on a properly insulated thatched roof, it actually adds another layer of insulation rather than causing problems. The snow prevents heat from escaping upward, while its white surface reflects what little winter sunlight penetrates the grey clouds. Windows, those small openings that allow light and air into the cottage during summer, must be carefully managed as winter approaches. Only the wealthy can afford glass, so peasant windows consist of wooden shutters or frames covered with oiled cloth, animal bladder, or thin scraped horn. These materials allow some light to filter through while blocking the worst of the wind. As temperatures drop, many families choose to close their shutters entirely, accepting the resulting darkness as the price of warmth. The single doorway, usually positioned on the southern or eastern side of the cottage to avoid the prevailing winter winds, gets fitted with extra layers of protection. Heavy cloth or animal hides hang inside the door frame, creating an additional barrier against drafts. Some families construct a small exterior porch using scrap wood and thatch, creating an airlock effect that prevents cold air from rushing directly into the living space whenever someone enters or exits. Inside the cottage, the earthen floor receives special attention before winter fully arrives. Some families dig down a few inches and refill the space with a fresh layer of compressed clay mixed with straw, creating a smoother and slightly more insulated surface. Others simply sweep the existing floor clean and cover it with fresh rushes or straw that will be replaced periodically throughout the winter. These floor coverings serve multiple purposes, providing a small amount of insulation from the cold ground below, absorbing moisture and spills, and releasing a pleasant grassy scent when stepped upon. The central hearth, typically located in the middle of the single room, becomes the absolute focus of life in a medieval village during winter. This fire will burn continuously for months, never allowed to go completely cold because restarting a fire requires effort and resources that struggling families cannot waste. The hearth itself might be nothing more than a ring of stones set into the earthen floor, with no chimney to carry smoke away. Instead, smoke rises to the rafters and gradually seeps out through gaps in the thatch, leaving everything and everyone inside covered with a fine layer of soot. Later, medieval cottages sometimes include a smoke hood, a large funnel-shaped structure made from wattle and daub that hangs over the hearth and channels smoke upward and out through a hole in the roof. This improvement makes the interior more comfortable but also allows more heat to escape, creating a trade-off between breathable air and maximum warmth. The peasants who lived through these winters understood their homes intimately, knowing which cracks whistled in certain winds, which corners stayed warmest, and exactly how much wood needed to burn each day to maintain survivable temperatures. Darkness falls early in winter, sometimes by 4 in the afternoon, and with darkness comes a cold that seems to intensify moment by moment. The family gathers close to the hearth, children sitting nearest the flames, while adults occupy positions slightly further back. The fire's orange glow provides the only light, casting dancing shadows on smoke-darkened walls and illuminating faces made ruddy by the heat. Outside, the wind picks up, finding every small gap in the cottage's defences and pushing cold fingers of air inside. But the family is prepared, their home fortified as well as their resources allow, ready to endure whatever the winter brings. The food that sustained them. Medieval winter survival depended absolutely on successful food preservation, because fresh food simply did not exist during the coldest months. The growing season ended completely by October in most of Europe, sometimes earlier in northern regions, and would not resume until April or even May. This meant that every person needed enough stored food to last 6 to 8 months. An enormous quantity considering that peasants lived perpetually on the edge of subsistence even during good years. The autumn slaughter was the first major step in building winter food supplies. Peasant families owned few animals, perhaps a pig or two, some chickens, maybe a cow or a few sheep if they were relatively prosperous. These animals required fodder throughout the winter, and there was never enough hay and grain stored to feed all of them until spring. Therefore, sometime in November, most families slaughtered all but their essential breeding stock, preserving the meat through salting, smoking, or both. The slaughter day was simultaneously festive and sombre, a recognition that the family's survival required the death of animals they had raised and tended all year. Nothing was wasted. The blood was caught in bowls and mixed with grain and fat to make blood pudding, a nutrient-dense food that could be cooked immediately or preserved. The organs, including the heart, liver, kidneys, and intestines, were eaten first because they spoiled quickly. The meat was carefully butchered into manageable pieces, while the bones were saved for making broth throughout the winter. Even the hide, hooves, and sinews were preserved for making leather, glue, and cordage. Salting meat was the primary preservation method available to peasants, though salt itself was expensive and not everyone could afford sufficient quantities. The process required rubbing coarse salt into every surface of the meat, then layering the pieces in a wooden barrel with more salt between each layer. The salt drew moisture out of the meat, creating an environment where bacteria could not thrive. After several weeks in the salt cure, the meat became hard, dark, and intensely salty. But it would remain edible for months if kept dry and cool. Smoked meat offered another preservation option, particularly for families who could not afford large quantities of salt. The smoking process required building a small smokehouse or dedicating a corner of the cottage where meat could be hung near the hearth, exposed to smoke for weeks or even months. The smoke deposited various compounds on the meat's surface that inhibited bacterial growth, while also imparting a strong woody flavour. Meat that was both salted and smoked lasted longest, but the resulting product bore little resemblance to fresh meat, being tough, dry, and requiring long cooking in liquid to become edible. Grain, the absolute foundation of peasant daily life, was stored in sacks, barrels, or dedicated grain bins inside the cottage or in a separate small structure. Wheat, barley, rye, and oats made up the bulk of the stored grain, each serving different purposes. Wheat made the finest bread but was often sold or surrendered to the lord as rent, leaving peasants with the coarser grains. Barley went into pottage, a thick soup or stew that appeared at nearly every meal. Oats fed both people and animals, being hardy enough to grow in poor soil and nutritious enough to sustain life. Keeping grain dry and safe from rodents presented constant challenges. Mice and rats could devastate a winter's food supply in a matter of weeks if given access. Peasant families employed various strategies to protect their stores, including keeping cats, setting primitive traps, and elevating grain storage off the floor. Regular inspection was necessary because grain could also spoil from moisture or develop mold that made it dangerous to eat. A family that discovered mouldy grain faced a terrible choice whether to risk eating it or face hunger later in the winter. Root vegetables, including turnips, parsnips, carrots, and onions, could be stored in cool, dark conditions for extended periods. Many families dug storage pits outside their cottages, lining them with straw and covering them with earth to create a consistently cool environment. Other families dedicated a corner of their cottage to vegetable storage, piling the roots in baskets or directly on the floor and covering them with straw. The vegetables slowly lost moisture and became increasingly shriveled as winter progressed, but they remained edible and provided essential variety in an otherwise monotonous diet. Dried peas and beans were another critical food source, providing protein in a diet that contained very little meat even after the autumn slaughter. These legumes dried naturally in their pods during autumn and could be stored for years if kept dry. Cooked into pottage along with grain, salted meat, and root vegetables, they created a thick, filling meal that kept bodies warm and provided enough energy for survival. Dairy products were scarce during winter because cows and goats produced little or no milk when grass was not available for grazing. However, cheese made during the summer and autumn could be preserved through waxing or aging, providing occasional protein throughout the cold months. Hard cheeses lasted longest, their low moisture content preventing spoilage. These cheeses were often extremely strong tasting by modern standards, but they represented valuable nutrition and were carefully rationed. Bread, the staple food of the Middle Ages, changed character during winter. Fresh bread baked from flour was a luxury even in good times, and many peasants made do with older, harder bread or relied more heavily on pottage. Baking required fuel for a hot oven, a resource increasingly precious as winter progressed. Some villages had a communal oven where families could bake their bread in exchange for a portion of the finished product or a small payment to the lord who owned the oven. Others baked flatbreads directly on hot stones near the hearth, a method that used less fuel but produced a denser, less appealing product. The daily meal routine during winter was remarkably simple and monotonous by modern standards. Most families ate twice per day, once in mid-morning after completing early chores, and again in late afternoon before darkness fell completely. The meals were nearly identical, consisting of pottage, bread if available, and perhaps a small piece of salted meat or cheese. The pottage bubbled constantly in a pot hanging over the hearth, with ingredients added as they became available, and the pot never completely emptied. This continuous cooking method meant that fuel was used efficiently, and food was always ready when hunger struck. Taste was not the priority when it came to food in a medieval village during winter. Survival was the only goal, and meals were consumed for the calories and warmth they provided, rather than any pleasure they might give. The salted meat was often so salty it had to be soaked in water before cooking. The grain was coarse and sometimes contained grit from the grinding stones. The vegetables were limp and earthy, but this food, unappetizing as it may sound, was the difference between life and death, and peasants ate gratefully, knowing that many winters brought famine, where even these poor provisions ran out before spring arrived. The psychological aspect of watching food supplies dwindle as winter dragged on cannot be overstated. Every peasant family knew roughly how much food they had stored and how long it needed to last. As January turned to February and February to March, the barrels grew lighter, the vegetable piles shrank, and every meal became a calculation, whether to eat enough to feel satisfied or save a bit more for the uncertain weeks ahead. Children were fed first, then working adults, with elderly family members, sometimes receiving reduced portions, on the understanding that the young and productive needed strength most. Hunger was a constant companion in life in a medieval village during winter. Not the acute starvation that kills within weeks, but the chronic undernourishment that leaves people weak, cold, and susceptible to disease. Peasants learned to live with the hollow feeling in their stomachs, the way their clothes hung looser as winter progressed, the light-headedness that came from rising too quickly. They saved their strength for essential tasks and spent as much time as possible resting near the fire, conserving energy until the season turned and the desperate wait finally ended. The animals that shared their homes. One of the most striking aspects of medieval winter survival was the relationship between peasants and their animals, a relationship so intimate that it would shock most modern people. Animals were not merely kept nearby, they literally shared the living space with their human caretakers, sleeping, eating, and breathing in the same enclosed environment throughout the coldest months. This arrangement served multiple practical purposes while also creating conditions that were, by contemporary standards, remarkably unsanitary. The animals that survived the autumn slaughter needed protection from winter just as much as humans did. A cow, sheep, or pig that froze to death represented a catastrophic loss for a peasant family, both in terms of the animal's immediate value and its potential for future breeding and production. Therefore, the logical solution was to bring animals inside, where the family's fire and the shelter's insulation could keep temperatures above freezing. In the smallest cottages, this meant that animals occupied one end of the single room while humans occupied the other. A low barrier of woven sticks or stacked wood might separate the two areas, but the division was symbolic rather than effective. In slightly larger homes, animals might have a dedicated section partitioned by a more substantial wall, or they might be housed in an attached structure that shared a wall with the human living space, allowing heat to transfer between the two areas. The warmth generated by animal bodies was not insignificant. A single cow produces a substantial amount of body heat, while a pen full of chickens or a couple of pigs add measurable warmth to an enclosed space. For peasants living in inadequately heated homes, this extra warmth could make the difference between bearable cold and dangerous cold. The animals also benefited from the heat of the human fire, creating a mutually beneficial arrangement even if it came with considerable drawbacks. The smell must have been overwhelming. Animal waste, unwashed bodies, smoke from the hearth, cooking food, damp wool, and rotting straw all combined to create an atmosphere that would be intolerable to anyone not accustomed to it from birth. But medieval peasants had different standards of cleanliness and air quality than modern people, and they accepted these conditions as normal and unavoidable. The alternative, keeping animals outside to freeze while struggling to keep the cottage warm enough for human survival, was clearly worse. Caring for indoor animals added to the daily work burden, particularly for women and children. The animals needed feeding from precious stored fodder, water that had to be carried from the well or stream even when it meant breaking through ice, and regular cleaning of their living area to prevent the accumulation of waste. The soiled straw and manure was hauled outside and piled in a midden heap that would eventually be spread on the fields as fertilizer. In the coldest weather, this chore was particularly miserable, requiring someone to brave the elements multiple times per day. Chickens were among the most common animals kept through winter because they were small, ate relatively little, and continued to provide eggs, even if production dropped significantly during the shortest days. A dozen chickens might roost in a corner of the cottage, their soft clucking and occasional squawking becoming part of the background noise of daily life. Their droppings were acidic and smelly, but chickens also ate insects and food scraps, making them useful in managing household waste. Pigs, when kept through winter, were usually young animals being raised to slaughter the following autumn. They were intelligent, curious, and willing to eat almost anything, making them both entertaining and practical. A pig might sleep near the hearth, grunting contentedly in the warmth, or root through the floor rushes searching for dropped food. Their presence added both warmth and a certain liveliness to the cottage, though they also required substantial feeding to maintain their weight through the lean months. Cows and oxen were the most valuable animals a peasant family could own, and their preservation through winter was a top priority. These large animals needed significant quantities of hay and sometimes supplemental grain to maintain their condition. A cow that survived the winter but emerged too weak to plough or produce milk was only marginally useful, so feeding had to be adequate despite the strain it placed on food stores. The cow's body heat and steady, rhythmic breathing became a comforting presence in the cottage, a reminder that life continued even in the depths of winter. Sheep, with their thick wool coats, were somewhat better equipped to handle cold than other livestock, but they still needed shelter from the worst weather and protection from predators. Multiple families might pool resources to construct a shared sheepfold, a sturdy structure where all the village sheep could be housed together. The combined body heat of dozens of sheep could keep the shelter surprisingly warm, and families took turns checking on the flock and providing supplemental feeding. The emotional bonds between peasants and their animals should not be underestimated. These were not modern pets, kept purely for companionship, but the line between working animal and family member was often blurry. Children grew up alongside calves, lambs, and piglets, learning to care for them and inevitably becoming attached. Adults recognized individual animals by sight and personality, knowing which cow was stubborn, which pig was clever, which chicken was the best layer. The necessary pragmatism that led to slaughter and consumption existed alongside genuine affection, a duality that characterized much of peasant daily life. Wild animals also sought shelter during the harshest weather, sometimes bringing them into uncomfortable proximity with human habitation. Mice and rats have already been mentioned as pests that threatened food supplies, but other creatures might also appear. Wolves, driven by hunger, occasionally approached villages, their howling audible in the night and their tracks visible in the snow come morning. Villagers kept their valuable livestock close and carried sticks or crude weapons when venturing outside after dark. The fear of wolves was not irrational. Attacks on isolated humans were rare but not unknown, and the death of a cow or sheep to wolf predation was a genuine disaster. Smaller predators like foxes and weasels posed threats primarily to chickens and other birds. A fox clever enough to find a way into a cottage or chicken coop could kill an entire flock in a single night, taking only 1 or 2 bodies and leaving the rest dead from wounds and panic. Preventing such incursions required constant vigilance and maintenance of the cottage's integrity, blocking any hole large enough for a predator to squeeze through. As winter deepened and snow covered the ground in a thick blanket, the cottage became an island of warmth and life, surrounded by a landscape that seemed increasingly hostile and empty. Inside, humans and animals shared their space, their warmth, and their fates, all of them waiting together for the spring that seemed impossibly far away, passing the time when darkness ruled. The winter days were short, brutally short, with barely 8 hours of daylight at the solstice in most of Europe, and even less in northern regions. This meant that peasants spent the majority of their time in darkness or near darkness, huddled in their cottages with only the fire for light. Candles were far too expensive for regular use, made from either beeswax, which was a luxury product, or rendered animal fat, which was better used for cooking. A rushlight, made by dipping a dried rush in fat, provided a dim, smoky flame that lasted perhaps an hour. Most peasants used rushlights sparingly, if at all, preferring to rely on firelight and simply accepting that darkness meant limited activity. The daily routine during winter was dictated by the availability of light and the necessity of conserving energy. People rose at dawn, not by choice, but because there was no point staying in bed once you were awake and the daylight hours were too precious to waste. The first task was always tending the fire, adding wood carefully to bring it back to useful strength without creating a wasteful blaze. Someone, usually a woman or adolescent child, would then venture outside to break ice in the water bucket or make the cold walk to the village well. Morning chores included feeding animals, checking that the cottage had suffered no damage during the night, and beginning the day's cooking. The pottage pot went back over the fire, and fresh ingredients were added as available. Meanwhile, anyone capable of working turned their attention to the essential indoor tasks that filled the winter months. There was always work, but it was different from the exhausting physical labour of the farming season. Winter work happened inside, by firelight, and required skill and patience rather than brute strength. Textile production was perhaps the most important winter activity, particularly for women and older children. Every person in medieval Europe wore clothing made from wool or linen, fabrics that were produced entirely by hand through a series of labour-intensive processes. Winter provided the time to spin thread, weave cloth, and sew garments that would be needed throughout the coming year. The work was endless, because clothing wore out quickly under the harsh conditions of peasant daily life, and growing children constantly needed larger sizes. Spinning was a task that could be done by almost anyone, from young children just learning the skill to elderly women whose hands were no longer strong enough for other work. The spinner sat near the fire, drawing out fibres from a bundle of cleaned wool or flax, and twisting them into thread using a drop spindle, a weighted stick that hung suspended as it turned. The motion was rhythmic and meditative, the same gesture repeated thousands of times, while the thread slowly accumulated on the spindle. A skilled spinner could produce fine, even thread without looking, allowing them to talk, supervise children, or simply stare into the fire while their hands worked automatically. The sound of spinning and weaving filled medieval cottages during winter, a soft whir and click that became the soundtrack of life in a medieval village during the cold months. Weaving required more space and equipment than spinning, and not every household owned a loom. Some families brought their spun thread to a village weaver, who worked in exchange for a portion of the finished cloth or some other payment. Others possessed simple, portable looms that could produce narrow bands of fabric suitable for belts, straps, and trim. Men and boys focused on tool maintenance, and the creation of items needed for the coming agricultural season. Wooden handles for hoes, rakes, and scythes wore out regularly and needed replacement. Carving a new handle from a length of seasoned wood was time-consuming work that required a sharp knife and patience. The wood had to be shaped to fit the user's hand comfortably, then carefully fitted to the metal blade or tool head, and secured with wooden pegs or leather bindings. A man might spend an entire week creating a single perfect scythe handle, but that handle would last for years and could mean the difference between an efficient harvest and a failed one. Basket weaving was another common winter task, producing the containers needed for carrying grain, vegetables, tools, and countless other items. Baskets wore out quickly with heavy use, and a household could never have too many. The materials, willow withes and other flexible plant stems, had been gathered during autumn and stored in a damp place to keep them pliable. The weaver soaked the withes in water to make them even more flexible, then wove them into the desired shape, working by firelight and relying on memory and experience rather than any written pattern. Leather work occupied those who had the necessary materials. Repairing shoes was a constant necessity because most peasants owned only a single pair, and the rough ground and wet conditions destroyed footwear rapidly. A cobbler might spend the winter resoling and patching shoes for multiple families, accepting payment in food, labour, or other goods. Leather was also used for harnesses, belts, bags, and numerous other items that required regular maintenance. The grinding and sharpening of tools was ongoing work throughout winter. Metal was valuable and expensive, so tools were never discarded as long as they could be repaired. A blade that became chipped or bent could be pounded back into shape on an anvil if anyone in the village had the necessary skill. Sharpening required a whetstone and patience, running the blade across the stone at the correct angle while water or oil carried away the metal dust. The ringing sound of metal on stone was another characteristic winter sound, mixing with the crackle of the fire and the clicking of the loom. Children had their own work and also their own play, though the line between the two was not always clear. Young children learned by imitating their elders, pretending to spin with a small stick while their mother worked with a real spindle, or whittling soft wood with a dull knife while their father carved tool handles. These games were actually training, preparing children for the roles they would assume as adults. Play that had no productive purpose was not forbidden, but it was not particularly encouraged either. Time and resources were too limited for activities that did not contribute to survival. Storytelling filled the long, dark hours when work was impossible or when the family simply needed rest. Medieval peasants had rich oral traditions, passing down stories, songs, legends, and practical knowledge through spoken word rather than written text. The vast majority of peasants were illiterate, and books were rare objects that most would never see in their entire lives. But the absence of written material did not mean ignorance. These people carried vast libraries in their memories, stories of saints and miracles, tales of heroes and monsters, bawdy jokes, work songs, children's rhymes, and the accumulated wisdom of generations. An elderly grandparent might tell stories of winters past, both the terrible ones when people starved and the miraculous ones when an unexpected thaw brought relief. These stories served multiple purposes, entertaining and educating, while also reinforcing social bonds and cultural identity. The younger generation learned what to expect from life, what dangers to watch for, and how their ancestors had survived similar hardships. The stories created continuity between past and present, assuring listeners that they were part of a long chain of survival stretching back through time. Religious observances structured the winter months, giving shape to time that might otherwise blur into an undifferentiated stretch of cold and darkness. The Christmas season, beginning in late December and extending through Epiphany in early January, was the major celebration of the winter, a time when even poor peasants tried to create a bit of festivity and abundance. Extra food might be prepared, using precious reserves to make special breads, meat dishes, and if possible, sweet treats flavoured with dried fruit or honey. The village would gather at the church for services, dressed in their best clothes, seeking spiritual warmth when physical warmth was in such short supply. Other feast days punctuated the winter calendar, including Candlemas in early February, and various saints' days that were observed with prayers, special foods, and sometimes a break from work. These celebrations were not grand by modern standards, but they provided something to anticipate, a reason to keep going when the cold seemed endless and the food supplies continued to shrink. Music was another way to pass time and lift spirits. Simple instruments like wooden flutes, small drums, and stringed instruments similar to fiddles existed even in poor communities. Someone with musical talent was valued for the entertainment they provided, and a skilled musician might be invited to play at celebrations or simply to provide music during long winter evenings. Dancing was possible even in cramped cottages, and the physical activity helped warm cold bodies while providing a welcome distraction from hunger and discomfort. Games existed as well, though they were simple compared to modern entertainment. Dice made from carved bone or wood were common, used for both harmless gambling and children's games. Board games using pebbles or carved pieces on boards, scratched into wood or drawn in the ashes near the hearth provided mental stimulation. Riddles, wordplay, and verbal contests tested wit and intelligence without requiring any materials at all. As night fell, which happened early in winter, sometime between 4 and 5 in the afternoon, the family's activities gradually wound down. There was simply not enough light to continue working safely, and fuel had to be conserved. People ate their evening meal, banked the fire to burn slowly through the night, and went to bed far earlier than would seem natural to anyone accustomed to electric lighting. Sleep was not always easy despite the exhaustion of daily life. The cold crept in, the animals stirred and made noise, children woke crying, and adults lay awake worrying about food supplies, sick relatives, or the seemingly endless stretch of winter still ahead. But sleep eventually came, and with it dreams of spring, of green grass and warm sunshine, of fresh food and freedom from the constant bite of cold that characterized every moment of life in a medieval village during winter. The diseases that came with cold. Winter brought not only hunger and cold but also sickness, a third horseman of suffering that claimed many lives before spring arrived. The combination of poor nutrition, inadequate heating, close quarters, and limited hygiene created ideal conditions for disease to spread through medieval communities. Understanding the health challenges of medieval winter survival helps explain why these months were genuinely life-threatening, particularly for the very young, the elderly, and anyone already weakened by other conditions. Respiratory illnesses were the most common winter ailments, spread easily in the confined spaces where families huddled together for warmth. What we now call the common cold, influenza, and various lung infections circulated through villages every winter, sometimes as mild inconveniences and other times as deadly epidemics. A simple cough could progress to pneumonia in a body weakened by hunger and chronic cold exposure. Without antibiotics or any understanding of germ theory, there was little medieval healers could do except provide supportive care and hope the patient's body fought off the infection. The constant smoke inside poorly ventilated cottages damaged lungs over time, making respiratory problems worse. Peasants breathed smoke from the moment they woke until they went to sleep, every single day of their lives. This chronic exposure caused persistent coughing, difficulty breathing, and increased susceptibility to infections. Modern examinations of medieval skeletons often reveal evidence of respiratory disease, confirming what the historical records suggest, that breathing was a challenge for many people. Skin conditions proliferated in the winter environment. The combination of smoke, dirt, animal contact, shared sleeping spaces, and limited washing created perfect conditions for parasites and infections. Lice were nearly universal among medieval peasants, living in hair, clothing, and bedding. These tiny parasites caused constant itching and could spread diseases, including typhus, a serious bacterial infection that caused high fever, headache, and rash. A typhus epidemic could devastate a community, killing the strong as readily as the weak. Fleas were equally common, feeding on both humans and animals, and making the itching and discomfort even worse. Like lice, fleas could spread disease, most famously bubonic plague, though the Great Plague years occurred during warmer seasons when flea populations peaked. Still, the constant presence of biting insects added to the general misery of winter life and drained small amounts of blood that poorly nourished bodies could ill afford to lose. Scabies, caused by tiny mites that burrow into skin, was another common winter problem. The mites spread through close physical contact and shared bedding, both unavoidable in medieval cottages. The resulting rash and intense itching were torturous, and scratching led to secondary infections that could become serious. Treatments included various herbal preparations and sulfur compounds, but they were not always effective, and reinfection was common in environments where the mites could survive in clothing and bedding. Frostbite and other cold injuries affected people who had to work outside despite dangerous temperatures. Fingers, toes, ears, and noses were most vulnerable, suffering tissue damage when blood flow decreased in response to extreme cold. Mild frostbite caused temporary numbness and skin damage, while severe cases resulted in tissue death and eventual loss of affected body parts. A person who lost fingers to frostbite might be permanently disabled, unable to perform the manual labor that defined peasant daily life. Hypothermia, the dangerous lowering of core body temperature, was a real risk for anyone caught outside during the worst weather, or for families whose heating was inadequate. The symptoms included shivering, confusion, sleepiness, and eventually loss of consciousness. Medieval people understood that someone found collapsed in the cold needed to be warmed slowly and carefully, though they did not understand the physiological mechanisms involved. Many people who seemed dead from cold could be revived with proper care, but many others simply never woke up, their bodies unable to recover from the deep cold. Malnutrition manifested in various ways throughout the winter, as food supplies dwindled and diets became increasingly inadequate. Scurvy, caused by vitamin C deficiency, produced bleeding gums, loose teeth, weakness, and poor wound healing. Medieval peasants did not understand vitamins, but they knew empirically that certain foods prevented certain illnesses. Stored root vegetables and any available greens helped prevent scurvy, but supplies of fresh food often ran out before winter ended, leaving people vulnerable. Other vitamin deficiencies caused their own problems. Lack of vitamin D, normally produced when sunlight hits skin, contributed to bone weakness and increased illness susceptibility. The combination of shortened daylight hours, heavy clothing, and staying indoors meant that winter brought very little sun exposure. Rickets, a childhood disease caused by severe vitamin D deficiency, was common in medieval Europe, causing bone deformities that persisted throughout life. Digestive problems resulted from the monotonous, low-quality winter diet. Constipation was common due to lack of fresh vegetables and limited fluid intake when water had to be hauled from frozen sources. Conversely, spoiled or contaminated food caused diarrhea, a dangerous condition that could rapidly lead to fatal dehydration, especially in children. Every meal was a gamble whether the food would nourish or sicken, and the desperate hunger of late winter sometimes drove people to eat things they knew were questionable. Injuries that would be minor annoyances in modern times could become life-threatening in medieval winter conditions. A cut that became infected might progress to gangrene, killing otherwise healthy people. Burns from the ever-present fire were common, especially among children, and the resulting wounds easily became infected in the unsanitary cottage environment. Broken bones healed slowly and often poorly in bodies depleted of calcium and other nutrients. Mental and emotional health suffered as well, though medieval people did not conceptualize psychological illness the way we do today. The long darkness, confined quarters, constant cold, hunger, and anxiety about survival created what we would now recognize as depression and anxiety disorders. People became irritable, withdrawn, or despondent. Family conflicts escalated in the pressure cooker environment of the winter cottage. Some individuals simply gave up, losing the will to continue struggling and fading away despite having adequate physical resources to survive. The village healer, often a woman with knowledge passed down through generations, did what she could with the resources available. Herbal remedies treated some conditions with genuine effectiveness. Willow bark tea, containing the compound that would eventually become aspirin, reduced fever and pain. Honey applied to wounds had genuine antibacterial properties. Garlic, when available, fought infections. Many other remedies had no actual medical value, but provided psychological comfort. And the placebo effect should not be underestimated when discussing human survival. Prayer was perhaps the most common medical intervention, reflecting medieval people's belief that God controlled all events, including health and disease. The village priest blessed the sick, led prayers for healing, and provided last rites when recovery seemed impossible. For people with no other hope, faith offered comfort and meaning in suffering. Some recovered, which was attributed to divine mercy. Many died, which was understood as God's will. This worldview was not simply ignorance, but rather a coherent way of understanding reality when scientific medicine did not yet exist. Death was a constant presence in medieval villages, particularly during winter, when the combination of disease, cold, and hunger claimed the weakest members of society. Elderly people who had survived dozens of winters finally succumbed. Infants and small children, their bodies unable to maintain warmth and fight off infection simultaneously, died in numbers that seem shocking to modern sensibilities. Even healthy adults could be killed by sudden illness or accident, their deaths leaving gaping holes in families and communities. Burial during winter was difficult when the ground froze solid. Bodies might be kept in unheated outbuildings until the ground thawed enough to dig graves. In some regions, communities maintained a communal crypt where bodies could be stored during the coldest months. The delay in burial did not bother medieval people as much as it might disturb modern sensibilities. They were accustomed to death, having seen it many times, and the practical difficulties of winter burial were simply one more challenge to be endured. Yet, despite all these health challenges, many people survived. Human beings are remarkably resilient creatures, capable of enduring conditions that seem impossible. The peasants who lived through medieval winters did so through a combination of careful preparation, mutual support, hard-won knowledge, and sheer determination. They understood that winter was dangerous but survivable, and they did what was necessary to see their families through to spring. When the cold became dangerous, there were winters that tested even the most prepared communities, years when the cold went beyond normal hardship into the realm of genuine disaster. These extreme winters, occurring irregularly but inevitably, revealed the true fragility of medieval life, and left scars in the historical record that we can still read centuries later. Understanding these worst-case scenarios helps put ordinary medieval winter survival into perspective and shows just how close to the edge these communities lived. The winter of 1315 was one such disaster, part of what historians call the Great Famine that gripped northern Europe from 1315 to 1322. This crisis actually began with unusually cold and wet weather during the growing season, ruining crops across the continent. When winter arrived, people were already hungry and struggling. Then the cold intensified beyond anything in living memory, arriving early and refusing to release its grip. Rivers and ports froze solid. Livestock died in vast numbers. Grain supplies that were already insufficient shrank even further as hungry people consumed seed that should have been saved for spring planting. The chronicles from this period, written by monks who lived slightly better than peasants but still suffered, describe horrific conditions. People ate bark stripped from trees, boiling it into an indigestible mass that provided the psychological comfort of a full stomach if no real nutrition. Desperate families ate their seed grain, knowing they were dooming their future but unable to watch their children starve. Crime increased as people stole food from neighbours. Social order began to break down when survival became the only priority that mattered. Historical records suggest that between 10 and 25% of the population in affected areas died during the Great Famine years. The deaths were not evenly distributed. The poor and rural populations suffered most, while the wealthy, with their food reserves and ability to purchase grain at any price, largely survived. But even the privileged experienced hunger, and the psychological impact of witnessing such widespread suffering rippled through society for generations. The Little Ice Age, a period of cooling that lasted roughly from 1300 to 1850, brought many such brutal winters. During the coldest phases, glaciers advanced in mountain regions, growing seasons shortened dramatically, and winter temperatures dropped well below previous norms. The Thames River in London, which rarely freezes today, froze solid enough to hold frost fairs, where merchants set up booths and entertainments directly on the ice. While these fairs seem festive in retrospect, they were symptoms of climate conditions that caused widespread suffering and death. During extreme cold, all the survival strategies discussed earlier became inadequate. Fuel supplies ran out faster than expected because fires had to burn hotter and longer to maintain survivable indoor temperatures. Food that was supposed to last until spring disappeared by midwinter, leaving months of hunger ahead. Animals died despite being brought inside, their bodies unable to maintain warmth without adequate food. Water sources froze so solid that breaking through to reach water became a daily ordeal requiring picks and axes. The social fabric of communities was tested during these extreme winters. Would neighbours share their last food with a starving family next door? Would the wealthy open their better-stocked storehouses to help the desperate poor? Sometimes yes, and sometimes no. Medieval society had strong traditions of charity and mutual obligation, but it also had rigid hierarchies and the recognition that helping others might mean your own family starved. These terrible choices revealed both the best and worst of human nature. Villages where everyone cooperated and shared resources tended to survive better than those where individuals hoarded and looked out only for themselves. The lord who opened his granary and distributed grain, even knowing he would not be fully repaid, might find his peasants surviving in sufficient numbers to work the fields come spring. The lord who hoarded everything and let his peasants starve might have full storehouses, but no one to plant and harvest the next year's crop. Enlightened self-interest sometimes aligned with compassion to produce better outcomes for everyone. The church played a complex role during crisis winters. Monasteries and convents often had better resources than secular communities, with larger food stores, stronger buildings, and more efficient organization. Many religious communities fed the poor during winter, providing thin soup and bread to those who appeared at the monastery gates. This charity saved lives while also fulfilling religious obligations and maintaining social stability. However, religious houses also had to balance their charitable impulses against the need to survive themselves, and when food ran short, even monastery gates might close to outsiders. Individual acts of heroism and sacrifice marked these extreme winters. A mother eating less so her children could have more. A man breaking trail through deep snow to check on an elderly neighbour living alone. A healer walking through dangerous cold to tend to the sick in another household. These actions, often unrecorded and anonymous, were the threads that held communities together when everything seemed to be falling apart. Children suffered disproportionately during the worst winters. Their small bodies lost heat more quickly than adults, and they needed more food relative to their size to maintain growth and development. Medieval parents understood this and prioritized feeding children, but there were limits to what they could do. Some parents made the agonizing decision to place children with wealthier households, hoping the children would be fed as servants, even if it meant being separated indefinitely. Others sent children to monasteries, which sometimes accepted them as oblates, children dedicated to religious life. These decisions were not abandonment but desperate attempts to save children's lives by any means available. The return of spring after an extreme winter was bittersweet. The survivors emerged from their cottages to find a changed world, with empty homes standing as silent testimony to those who had not made it through. Fields needed planting, but there were fewer hands to do the work, and seed grain was scarce after a winter where people had eaten anything edible. The rebuilding would take years, and the memories would last a lifetime, passed down as warnings and wisdom to future generations. Yet even these worst winters eventually ended. The sun rose higher, snow melted, and green shoots pushed up through the soil. Life reasserted itself with the incredible tenacity that characterizes the natural world. The survivors married, had children, and rebuilt their communities. Within a generation, the disaster became a story, a cautionary tale told by the elderly to children who had never known such suffering. And the cycle continued, year after year, winter after winter, with humanity enduring because survival was the only option. The water problem. One aspect of medieval winter survival that deserves special attention is water, that most basic necessity that becomes surprisingly complicated when temperatures drop below freezing. Modern people turn a tap and receive clean water without thinking about where it comes from or how it reaches them. Medieval peasants had no such luxury, and accessing water during winter required constant effort and sometimes genuine courage. Most villages obtained water from wells, springs, or nearby streams and rivers. During summer, this was straightforward, if labour-intensive. Someone, usually a woman or child, walked to the water source carrying wooden buckets or leather bags, filled them, and carried the heavy load back home. This might happen multiple times per day depending on the household's needs. The work was tiring but uncomplicated. Winter changed everything. Wells could freeze solid, if not deep enough to reach below the frost line. The ice that formed on the surface might be several inches thick, requiring tools to break through. Someone had to lower a bucket into the well, break the ice at the bottom, and haul up water that would begin freezing on the walk home. The rope that lowered the bucket became stiff and difficult to handle. The bucket itself might freeze to the well wall. Drawing water from a frozen well was cold, wet, miserable work that nonetheless had to be done daily. Streams and rivers presented different challenges. Moving water freezes less readily than still water, so streams often remained at least partially accessible even in cold weather. However, approaching a stream in winter meant walking across potentially treacherous ice and snow, then kneeling or bending near freezing water to fill containers. The banks might be icy and slippery, creating a real risk of falling into the water, which could be fatal in winter conditions. Wet clothing in freezing temperatures led quickly to hypothermia, and there was little chance of getting warm quickly enough to prevent serious harm. Some streams froze completely during the coldest weather, their surfaces becoming solid enough to walk on, but preventing access to the water below. This left peasants with the option of melting snow or ice, a process that required precious fuel and produced relatively little water for the effort involved. Snow is mostly air, and melting enough snow to meet a family's daily water needs meant using significant quantities of firewood that might be better used for heating or cooking. The quality of winter water was also questionable. Medieval people did not understand waterborne diseases, but they knew empirically that water from certain sources made people sick, while water from other sources was safer. Standing water was generally avoided when flowing water was available, and water drawn from deep wells was considered superior to surface water. During winter, the temptation to simply gather snow from right outside the door was strong, but melting random snow could mean consuming whatever the snow had fallen onto or through, including animal waste, roof, thatch, debris, or other contaminants. Water storage inside the cottage presented its own problems. Any water left standing would freeze solid unless kept very close to the fire. Some families kept a pot of water suspended over the hearth at all times, maintaining it at a temperature just above freezing. This water was never fresh and sometimes developed an unpleasant taste from being heated and cooled repeatedly, but it was liquid and available when needed. The amount of water used in medieval households during winter dropped dramatically compared to summer usage. Washing was minimal, limited to hands and faces, and even then done sparingly with cold water. Full-body bathing, never common among peasants, became almost unheard of during winter. The combination of cold temperatures, scarce water, and inadequate heating meant that people simply did not wash their bodies for months at a time. This contributed to the prevalence of skin conditions and parasites discussed earlier. Laundry was similarly reduced during winter. Clothes were worn for extended periods without washing, and when washing became absolutely necessary, it was done with minimal water and in cold conditions that made the work truly miserable. Wet fabric froze stiff almost immediately if taken outside, and drying laundry indoors near the fire was slow and used up space needed for other purposes. Most families simply accepted that winter meant dirty clothes and focused on keeping warm rather than clean. Animals also needed water, creating additional demand on limited supplies. A cow might drink 10 to 15 gallons per day under normal conditions, though water consumption decreased somewhat in cold weather. Chickens and pigs needed water as well, though in smaller quantities. Providing water for animals meant either bringing it inside, where it would not freeze immediately, or taking the animals outside to drink and bringing them back in quickly. Both options were difficult and time-consuming. Ice itself became a resource in some circumstances. Large blocks of ice could be cut from frozen ponds or rivers and stored in insulated ice houses, where they would remain frozen for months or even through the summer. This ice could then be melted as needed to provide water. However, constructing and maintaining an ice house required resources that most peasants did not have. This technology existed but was primarily used by wealthy households and institutions, like monasteries that had the means to invest in such infrastructure. The contrast between water abundance and water scarcity was striking. Medieval Europe was generally a well-watered region, with adequate rainfall and numerous rivers and streams. In summer, water was everywhere, sometimes too much of it when rain ruined crops or flooded fields. But winter transformed this abundance into scarcity, freezing the water that was physically present and making it inaccessible or requiring significant effort to obtain. This seasonal transformation was another way that winter made basic survival more challenging and more work-intensive. Understanding the water situation helps explain other aspects of medieval winter life. The minimal washing, the prevalence of disease, the constant low-level discomfort, and the sheer amount of labor required to maintain basic existence all connect to the simple fact that water, despite being everywhere, was difficult to access and use during the coldest months. This is one more example of how medieval winter survival was not about a single overwhelming challenge, but rather an accumulation of difficulties that made every aspect of life harder. The psychology of waiting. Beyond the physical challenges of cold, hunger, and disease, medieval winter imposed a psychological burden that was equally real if less visible. The experience of winter was fundamentally about waiting, about enduring the present while hoping for a future that seemed impossibly distant. Understanding the mental and emotional dimensions of medieval winter survival reveals depths that purely physical descriptions cannot capture. Time moved differently during medieval winters. The modern world, with its clocks, calendars, and constant activity, gives us many ways to mark time's passage and create a sense of progress. Medieval peasants had the sun, the seasons, the church calendar, and little else. During winter, when days were short and similar to one another, time could seem to stop entirely. Each day was much like the last, the same cold, the same hunger, the same smoky cottage and monotonous food. Without clear markers of progress, the winter could feel eternal, as if spring might never actually arrive. This temporal distortion created a particular kind of psychological stress. Modern research on isolated groups living in extreme conditions, such as Antarctic research stations, has documented how the combination of confinement, monotony, and inability to leave can affect mental health. Medieval peasants experienced something similar, trapped in their cottages by weather too dangerous to venture out in, with no real change in their circumstances from day to day, week to week. The lack of privacy in medieval cottages added another layer of psychological difficulty. Modern people generally have the option to retreat into solitude when stressed or overwhelmed. We can take a walk, shut a door, put in headphones, find some way to create physical or psychological distance from others. Medieval peasants had no such option. The entire family shared a single room, along with their animals, for months. There was nowhere to go for privacy, no way to escape the constant presence of others. This forced intimacy could strengthen family bonds, but it could also intensify conflicts. Small irritations that might be overlooked or forgotten in different circumstances could become major sources of tension when there was no escape from them. The person who chewed too loudly, the child who never stopped moving, the relative who told the same stories repeatedly. These minor annoyances could grow into serious problems when experienced constantly with no relief. Domestic violence undoubtedly increased during medieval winters, though the historical record rarely documents it. The combination of stress, confinement, alcohol consumption when available, and patriarchal power structures created conditions where abuse could flourish. Women and children were particularly vulnerable, having few options to escape dangerous situations. The village community might intervene in extreme cases, but the general attitude was that what happened inside a family was the husband's business. Seasonal affective disorder, now recognized as a real condition caused by lack of sunlight exposure, certainly affected medieval people, even though they had no name for it. The shortened days and limited time outdoors would have reduced sunlight exposure dramatically. Modern understanding of the condition suggests that many medieval peasants probably experienced symptoms including depression, lethargy, increased sleep, and carbohydrate cravings. These symptoms would have been attributed to moral failing or spiritual crisis rather than biological causes, adding guilt and shame to the suffering. Hope was carefully cultivated and fiercely protected during medieval winters. The feast days and religious celebrations that punctuated the winter calendar served not just spiritual purposes but psychological ones as well. They provided something to look forward to, brief moments of celebration and abundance in the midst of deprivation. The anticipation of these events could help people endure the difficult periods between them, and the memories could sustain them afterwards. Stories and oral tradition also served psychological purposes. The tales of past winters survived and overcome reminded people that their situation, however difficult, was temporary and survivable. The stories of saints who endured suffering and were rewarded provided a framework for understanding their own suffering as meaningful rather than pointless. The bawdy jokes and humorous stories provided laughter, which is a powerful tool for maintaining mental health even in difficult circumstances. Dreams and imagination offered escape that physical reality denied. People could dream of spring, of warm sun and green grass, of abundant food and freedom of movement. These dreams cost nothing and provided psychological relief from the grimness of present reality. The ability to imagine a better future, to mentally escape current circumstances, is a crucial survival skill that humans have refined over millennia. Religious faith provided comfort and meaning to many people. The belief that suffering had purpose, that God was watching and would ultimately reward the faithful, made hardship more bearable. Prayer offered a sense of control in situations where material control was impossible. The village church provided community and a sense of belonging to something larger than individual suffering. For people with strong faith, these psychological benefits were real and valuable regardless of whether the underlying religious claims were true. But not everyone had strong faith, and not everyone found comfort in religious explanations. Some people undoubtedly struggled with despair, with the feeling that life was meaningless, suffering that would never end. The historical record rarely captures these individual psychological crises, but they certainly occurred. Some people gave up, simply stopped fighting to survive, and allowed themselves to die. This was probably not common, but it happened, and it represents the extreme end of the psychological burden that winter imposed. Resilience, the ability to maintain psychological function despite adverse circumstances, varied among individuals just as it does today. Some people seemed naturally equipped to endure hardship with grace and humour, maintaining optimism and helping others even when their own situation was dire. Others struggled constantly, experiencing every day as a battle against despair. Most fell somewhere in the middle, having good days and bad days, coping adequately most of the time but occasionally feeling overwhelmed. The psychological experience of medieval winter survival reminds us that humans are not merely bodies that need food and warmth. We are minds and emotions as well, and those aspects of our being need sustenance just as much as our physical bodies. The peasants who survived medieval winters did so not only through physical preparation and community support, but also through psychological strength, maintained hope, and the ability to find meaning and even joy in circumstances that offered little objective reason for either. The clothing that protected them. The garments that medieval peasants wore during winter represented the difference between survival and freezing, yet these clothes were vastly different from modern cold weather gear. Understanding medieval winter clothing reveals another layer of the resourcefulness and ingenuity that characterized peasant daily life. Every thread was spun by hand, every piece of fabric woven on a simple loom, and every garment sewn with needle and thread made from plant or animal fibre. The foundation of medieval peasant clothing was a long shirt or tunic made from linen or wool. Linen came from flax plants that had to be grown, harvested, soaked, beaten, combed, spun, and finally woven into fabric. The process took months of labour and produced a fabric that was cool in summer but provided little warmth in winter. Wool, by contrast, came from sheep that needed to be raised, sheared, cleaned, carded, spun, and woven. Wool retained warmth even when damp and was far superior for winter wear, but it was scratchy against skin and required underlayers to prevent constant irritation. Most peasants wore their basic tunic year-round, adding layers as weather demanded. Over the tunic went additional wool garments, perhaps another tunic or a simple wool dress for women. The concept of tailored, fitted clothing was largely unknown to peasants. Their garments were rectangles and tubes of fabric, sewn together with minimal shaping. This simple construction meant clothes could be made by people with basic sewing skills, and garments could be easily altered or repaired. Leg coverings varied by gender and wealth. Men wore simple wool leggings or hose that covered each leg separately and were tied to a belt around the waist. These provided some protection from cold, but were not particularly effective in deep snow or wet conditions. Women generally wore long skirts that dragged on the ground, collecting mud and moisture but also creating layers of fabric that trapped warm air. Both men and women understood that multiple thin layers provided better insulation than a single thick garment, and they dressed accordingly when conditions demanded. Outer garments provided additional protection from wind and precipitation. A cloak or mantle made from thick wool and often treated with lanolin to make it somewhat water-resistant was essential winter gear. These cloaks fastened at the shoulder or throat with a simple pin or tie and hung to various lengths depending on the wearer's needs and resources. A full-length cloak provided maximum coverage but was heavy and cumbersome. A shorter cloak allowed easier movement but left the legs exposed. Peasants who had to work outside, tending animals or gathering firewood, needed the mobility more than the coverage, and wore shorter cloaks despite the cold. Headwear was critical because significant body heat is lost through the head. Both men and women wore various forms of head coverings. Women typically wore linen caps tied under the chin, sometimes with a wool hood over the cap for extra warmth. Men wore wool caps or hoods attached to their cloaks. Covering the ears was particularly important, as exposed ears were highly susceptible to frostbite. The hoods that appear in illustrations from this period were not merely fashion choices but practical necessities for survival. Hands required protection, but gloves as we know them were rare among peasants. Mittens made from wool or leather provided some warmth while allowing basic manual tasks to be performed. More commonly, peasants simply tucked their hands into their clothing or held them close to their bodies when not actively working. The numbness that came from cold hands was an accepted part of winter life, something to be endured rather than prevented. Serious frostbite damage to fingers was common and could permanently reduce a person's ability to work. Footwear presented perhaps the greatest challenge. Leather shoes or boots were expensive and wore out quickly. Most peasants owned a single pair that had to last for years. The leather was often thin and poorly tanned, offering minimal insulation from cold ground. Some people stuffed their shoes with straw or rags to provide extra insulation and cushioning. Others wrapped their feet in cloth before putting on shoes, creating crude socks that helped somewhat but quickly became damp and uncomfortable. In the coldest weather, some peasants resorted to wrapping their feet and lower legs in strips of cloth or leather, secured with ties or thongs. This provided better insulation than shoes alone and could be more easily dried by the fire. The image of medieval peasants with their feet wrapped in rags is not merely a stereotype but reflects actual practice driven by necessity and limited resources. The problem of wet clothing was constant during winter. Snow melted on contact with body heat, dampening outer layers. Sweat from physical labour soaked inner layers. There was no effective way to waterproof fabric beyond the limited water resistance that lanolin provided to wool. Once clothing became wet, it had to be dried by the fire, a process that took hours and filled the cottage with the smell of damp wool and unwashed bodies. Many peasants simply wore damp clothing, accepting the discomfort because they had no alternative. Maintaining and repairing clothing was ongoing work throughout winter. Seams split from the stress of movement and wear. Fabric developed holes from friction and age. Vermin ate the fibres, particularly in stored clothing. Women spent countless hours darning holes, restitching seams, and patching damaged areas with scraps of fabric. A garment might be repaired dozens of times over its lifespan, becoming a patchwork of different fabrics and colours. There was no shame in wearing heavily mended clothing because everyone did so. Only the wealthy could afford to discard damaged garments and replace them with new ones. Children presented a special challenge because they outgrew their clothing while it was still serviceable. Families dealt with this by making children's garments intentionally large, with long hems that could be let down as the child grew and wide seams that could be let out. Hand-me-downs passed from older children to younger ones, with each garment serving multiple children over many years. By the time a tunic or dress reached the youngest child, it might be more patch than original fabric, but it still provided warmth and coverage, and that was what mattered. The colours of peasant clothing were overwhelmingly dull by modern standards. Dyeing fabric was expensive and time-consuming, requiring plants, minerals, or other materials that had to be gathered or purchased, then processed through complex procedures. Most peasants wore the natural colours of their fabrics, the grey-brown of undyed wool, the yellowish cream of linen, and the darker browns and greys that came from using different sheep's wool or dyeing with cheap, locally available materials like bark or leaves. Bright colours were markers of wealth and status, seen in the clothing of nobles but not in the practical garments of working people. The smell of medieval clothing is difficult to imagine from our modern perspective. These garments were rarely washed because washing required huge amounts of water, soap that had to be made from wood ash and fat, and time for drying. Instead, clothes were worn continuously for weeks or months, absorbing sweat, smoke, food smells, and the odours of the animals that shared the cottage. The clothing developed what modern people would consider an unbearable stench, but medieval peasants were accustomed to it and probably did not notice it consciously. Everyone smelled the same, and strong body odour was simply the normal human condition. Bedding and sleep clothing deserve mention as well, though the two were often the same thing. Most peasants slept in the same tunics they wore during the day, perhaps removing outer layers but keeping underlayers on for warmth. Beds, when they existed, were simple platforms or boxes filled with straw and covered with whatever fabric the family could spare. Blankets made from wool were precious possessions, often the most valuable textiles a family owned. Multiple people would sleep together under shared blankets, their combined body heat helping to keep everyone warm throughout the cold night. The effectiveness of medieval clothing should not be underestimated despite its primitive nature by modern standards. Wool is an excellent insulator, and multiple layers of wool can keep a person warm even in extreme cold, provided they stay reasonably dry. The peasants who survived medieval winters did so in part because their clothing, however crude and uncomfortable, provided enough protection to prevent freezing. Combined with the warmth from the hearth fire and the heat from the animals sharing their space, peasant clothing was adequate for survival, if not for comfort. Yet the limitations were real and consequential. Clothing that became soaked through from snow or rain lost much of its insulating value. Garments that were worn thin from years of use provided inadequate protection. People who could not afford sufficient layers suffered more from cold than those with better resources. The quality and quantity of one's winter clothing was yet another way that poverty could become life-threatening during the medieval winter months. The forest that sustained them. The forest loomed large in medieval peasant consciousness, particularly during winter when it provided resources essential for survival. Yet the relationship between peasants and the forest was complicated, governed by laws that restricted access and punishments that could be severe for those caught breaking those laws. Understanding this relationship reveals another dimension of the constant negotiation between needs and constraints that characterized life in a medieval village during the harsh winter months. Medieval forests were not the untamed wilderness that modern people might imagine. They were carefully managed resources, almost always owned by the local lord or the king, and every tree, every deer, every useful plant was considered property that could not be taken without permission. The forest provided timber for building and fuel for fires. It offered game for hunting and plants for food and medicine. But accessing these resources required navigating a complex system of rights, permissions, and often payments. Firewood was the most critical forest resource for winter survival. A single peasant household might need several cords of wood to make it through the winter, an enormous quantity that required months of labour to gather, cut, and transport. Dead wood, fallen branches, and standing dead wood were often available to peasants through established customary rites. These rites, passed down through generations and recognized by the local lord, allowed peasants to gather specific types of wood from designated areas at certain times. The distinction between different types of wood gathering was legally significant. Taking dead branches that had fallen to the ground might be permitted under common rights. Cutting living branches or felling standing trees, even dead ones, might be strictly forbidden. Breaking these rules could result in fines, physical punishment, or in extreme cases, mutilation or death. The severity of forest law varied by time and place, but it was always a factor that peasants had to navigate carefully. The actual work of gathering firewood was grueling physical labour. Peasants walked into the forest carrying axes, saws, and ropes. They identified suitable deadwood, cut it into manageable lengths, and bundled it for transport. Carrying heavy loads of wood through the forest and back to the village was exhausting work, particularly in snow and ice. Children and elderly family members might help by gathering smaller sticks and kindling, but the heavy work fell to adults in their prime years. The type of wood mattered for different purposes. Hardwoods like oak and beech burned slowly and produced intense heat, making them ideal for maintaining a fire through cold nights. Softwoods like pine burned faster and produced more smoke but were easier to ignite and useful for cooking. Peasants developed deep knowledge of the local trees, understanding which species burned best, which were easier to cut, which produced the least smoke, and which were most available in their area. Beyond firewood, the winter forest provided other essential resources. Bark from certain trees could be eaten in desperate times, though it provided minimal nutrition and was difficult to digest. The inner bark, called cambium, was more palatable and nutritious than outer bark, but stripping it killed the tree and was therefore usually forbidden. Peasants who resorted to eating bark were in truly desperate circumstances, having exhausted other food sources. Evergreen trees offered browse that could supplement animal fodder when stored hay ran low. Pine and spruce needles, while not nutritious, could fill the stomachs of cows and sheep, helping them survive until spring. Some peasants cut evergreen branches and brought them home to feed their animals, carefully staying within their allowed quotas and avoiding trees that the Lord had reserved for other purposes. Holly, ivy, and other plants that stayed green through winter had both practical and symbolic significance. They could be fed to animals in small quantities, and they were gathered to decorate homes and churches during the Christmas season. The sight of greenery during the dead of winter provided psychological comfort, a reminder that life persisted even when everything seemed frozen and dead. These decorations also had religious significance, representing eternal life and God's continuing care for creation. Hunting in the forest was heavily restricted, with game animals generally reserved for the Lord and his guests. Deer, boar, and other large game were strictly protected, and poaching them carried severe penalties. However, smaller animals like rabbits, squirrels, and birds were sometimes available to peasants, either through granted rights or through illegal poaching that carried less risk. A rabbit caught in winter could provide a family with fresh meat and a welcome break from their monotonous diet of preserved food. Trapping was more practical than hunting for most peasants because it required less time and skill. Simple snares and traps could be set in areas where small game was likely to pass, then checked periodically. A successful trap might yield a rabbit or bird without the need for expensive equipment or prohibited weapons. The legality of trapping varied, but it was generally more tolerated than active hunting because it was seen as less of a direct challenge to the Lord's hunting rights. The forest floor, even covered in snow, held resources for those who knew where to look. Certain fungi grew during winter or could be found dried on trees. Acorns and other nuts that had fallen during autumn might still be found by brushing away snow, and while these were typically animal food, desperate humans could eat them after proper preparation to remove bitter tannins. Every edible item mattered when food stores were running low and spring was still months away. The winter forest was also a place of danger. Wolves denned in forests and became bolder during winter when other prey was scarce. A person alone in the forest was vulnerable, particularly if caught there after dark. Peasants generally travelled in groups when venturing into the forest during winter, both for safety and to share the labour of carrying wood or other resources back to the village. Getting lost in the winter forest could be fatal. Snow obscured familiar landmarks, and the short days meant that darkness could fall before a person realised they had lost their way. Freezing to death was a real risk for anyone who could not find their way back to shelter before nightfall. Peasants learned the forest paths through long experience, often following the same routes their parents and grandparents had used, and they paid careful attention to landmarks that would remain visible even under snow. The sounds of the winter forest were different from those of summer. The absence of leaves meant that sound carried differently, and the silence could be profound when no birds sang and no insects buzzed. The crack of ice, the creak of frozen wood, and the occasional crash of a snow-laden branch falling were the primary sounds, creating an atmosphere that could feel either peaceful or eerie, depending on one's frame of mind. The relationship between the forest and the village was symbiotic but unequal. The village depended on the forest for resources essential to survival, but the forest was controlled by powers beyond the village's control. Peasants negotiated this relationship carefully, taking what they needed while trying to stay within the bounds of law and custom. The forest was both provider and threat, both resource and danger, and managing this duality successfully was part of what medieval winter survival required. The signs of spring. As January became February, and February struggled toward March, the peasants who had survived the winter's worst began watching for signs that their ordeal was nearing an end. These signs were subtle at first, easily missed by anyone not watching with desperate intensity, but to eyes trained by experience and longing, they appeared like promises written in the landscape. The return of spring was not a single moment but a gradual accumulation of small changes, each one bringing relief and hope in equal measure. The first sign was often in the light itself. Even before temperatures rose, the days began to lengthen noticeably. By February, sunset came perceptibly later than it had in December, and the sun rose higher in the sky at midday. This increased light brought no immediate warmth, but it lifted spirits and energized bodies that had been languishing in darkness. People could work longer outside, accomplishing necessary tasks without burning precious lamp oil or rushlights. Birds provided another early signal of changing seasons. The resident birds that had survived winter became more active and vocal, their songs marking territories and attracting mates. Then came the first migrants, hardy species that returned while snow still covered the ground. The sight of a robin or the sound of a lark was cause for celebration, proof that the world was turning as it should and that warmth would follow. The wind shifted, losing some of its bitter edge. Instead of the harsh north winds that had dominated winter, gentler breezes from the south and west began to appear, carrying moisture and slightly warmer temperatures. These winds brought rain instead of snow, and while rain was cold and miserable, it lacked the deadly danger of a winter blizzard. The sound of water dripping from eaves and running in tiny rivulets through the village paths was music to ears accustomed to the silence of snow and frost. Snow began to melt, not all at once but in stages. South-facing slopes lost their cover first, revealing brown grass matted and dead-looking but holding the promise of green beneath. The snowpack around buildings shrank slowly, pulling back from walls and exposing ground that had been frozen for months. This melting created a soggy, muddy mess that was difficult to navigate, but it was progress, visible proof that winter's grip was loosening. Ice broke up in streams and rivers, often with dramatic force. The sound of ice cracking and flowing water returning to its banks carried for surprising distances. This breakup was sometimes dangerous, with huge blocks of ice damming narrow channels and causing floods. But it was also exhilarating, a display of nature's power that signaled the transition between seasons. Villagers knew that flowing water meant they could resume fishing and no longer needed to break through ice to access water for drinking and cooking. The first green shoots appeared, tiny spears of grass or wild plants pushing up through the soil in protected spots. These early plants were treasured, often gathered and eaten despite being bitter or tough, simply because they were fresh food after months of preserved provisions. Peasants knew which wild plants were edible and where to look for them. Knowledge passed down through generations and critical for bridging the gap between winter stores running out and spring crops becoming available. Foraging intensified as more plants emerged. Young nettles, dandelion greens, wild garlic, and dozens of other plants appeared in succession, each welcomed and harvested. These greens provided vitamins that winter diets lacked, combating scurvy and general malnutrition. The taste of fresh, growing things after months of salted meat and old grain was literally life-giving, and people could feel their strength returning as their diets improved. Farm animals responded to spring's arrival with visible energy and relief. Cows and goats that had barely survived the winter on meagre fodder suddenly had access to fresh grass, and their milk production increased. This fresh milk was a luxury after months of having none, and it was consumed eagerly or made into cheese to preserve the bounty. Chickens increased their egg production as daylight hours lengthened. Even the pigs became more lively, rooting energetically through the muddy ground. The agricultural calendar now dictated a new rhythm of work. Fields that had lain dormant under snow needed preparation for planting. This meant intensive labour, ploughing with oxen or horse if the family owned such animals, or with human power if they did not. The soil needed to be turned, broken up, and smoothed before seed could be sown. This work was exhausting after a winter of limited activity and inadequate food, but it was necessary, and it was possible to do it outside in daylight without freezing, and that made all the difference. Planting began as soon as the ground was ready, with the calendar varying by region and specific weather conditions. Oats went in early, being hardy and cold-tolerant. Barley followed, then the more delicate wheat. Each type of grain had its optimal planting window, and peasants with generations of experience knew exactly when to sow for the best chance of success. The act of planting was simultaneously exhausting and hopeful, each seed representing faith that the cycle would continue, that the harvest would come, that there would be food for the next winter. Village life emerged from its winter hibernation. People who had rarely left their cottages during the coldest months now gathered in common areas, comparing notes on who had survived, how food stores had held out, and what plans needed to be made for the coming season. Marriages were often scheduled for spring, after winter had tested courting couples and once the immediate crisis of survival had passed. Babies conceived during the long winter nights would be born in autumn, their timing planned to avoid the deadly winter months. The physical transformation of the landscape was remarkable. Fields that had been white or brown took on a haze of green as crops sprouted. Trees budded, their bare branches suddenly dotted with swelling buds that would burst into leaves and flowers. The forest floor, brown and dead-looking just weeks before, became carpeted with wild flowers that bloomed in rapid succession, each species having evolved to bloom during a specific window of opportunity. Animals emerged from burrows and dens. Rabbits appeared in increasing numbers, their population explosion providing hunting opportunities for anyone with the skill and tools to catch them. Deer became more visible as they moved from deep forest to field edges to feed on new growth. These animals were technically the property of the Lord, and hunting them was often forbidden to peasants, but the laws were not always strictly enforced, and a hungry family might risk punishment for the chance of fresh meat. The village church held special services celebrating spring's return, with prayers of thanksgiving for survival and petitions for a successful growing season. The religious calendar aligned with the agricultural calendar, making spiritual and practical life inseparable. Easter, the most important Christian festival, was a movable feast that always fell in spring, its themes of resurrection and new life resonating deeply with people who had just survived winter's deathly cold. Children played outside again, their voices carrying across the village as they ran and shouted in ways that would have been impossible during winter. The freedom to move, to be warm, to see the sky without needing to hurry back inside was intoxicating. Adults felt it too, a lightening of the spirit that came with spring, an easing of the constant tension that had defined winter survival. Food was still not abundant in early spring, and this transitional period was sometimes called the hungry gap that stretched between winter stores running out and new crops being ready to harvest. But the pressure was easing, and the direction of change was clear. Each day brought warmer temperatures, longer daylight, more food, and greater hope. The worst was over, and everyone knew it. The physical exhaustion of winter began to lift as nutrition improved, and the need for constant vigilance against cold decreased. Bodies that had been clenched tight against the cold for months could finally relax. People slept better, worked more efficiently, and felt the return of an energy that had been so depleted it was almost forgotten. Looking back at the winter from the vantage point of late spring, survivors could hardly believe they had endured it. The memories were already becoming stories, the worst moments softening with distance, while the triumphs and small joys became more prominent. A winter survived was a winter conquered, and there was pride in that accomplishment even as everyone hoped that the next winter might be milder, the harvest more abundant, the suffering less intense. But they knew it would come again. Winter always returned, as reliable as the seasons themselves, and when it did, they would be ready again, because they had survived before and they would survive again. This was the life they knew, the only life most of them would ever know, a life defined by the eternal cycle of seasons and the constant struggle to survive another year in life in a medieval village, the wisdom they left behind. What can we learn from the people who survived medieval winters without any of the technology we consider essential? Their experience offers insights that remain relevant even in our modern world. Lessons about resilience, community, preparation, and the human capacity to endure hardship that seems unbearable. The first and most obvious lesson is the absolute importance of preparation. Medieval peasants did not survive winter by accident or luck. They survived because they spent the entire summer and autumn preparing, gathering and preserving food, fortifying their homes, and ensuring they had adequate fuel. This preparation required foresight, planning, and the discipline to save resources when immediate consumption would have been more enjoyable. In our modern world, we often live without thinking much about future needs, confident that grocery stores will always be stocked and that utilities will always function. The medieval example reminds us that this confidence may be misplaced. The people who thrive during disruptions are those who have prepared, who have stored food and water, who have alternative heating sources, who have thought through what they would need and taken steps to secure it. Community and mutual support were essential elements of medieval winter survival. No family could make it through entirely alone. The sharing of resources, knowledge, and labour was what allowed villages to survive when individual households might have perished. This interdependence created social bonds that were not merely friendly but vital for survival. Modern individualism sometimes blinds us to our continuing need for community. We pride ourselves on independence, on not needing help from others. But crisis situations reveal the truth that humans are social creatures who survive better when we work together. The medieval peasant who shared his last food with a starving neighbour understood something important that we have partially forgotten. Supporting others is not just moral behaviour, it is practical survival strategy. The acceptance of hardship without despair is another lesson from this era. Medieval peasants faced conditions that would break many modern people. Not just winter cold, but constant hunger, disease, physical pain, and the ever-present possibility of death. Yet they continued living, working, raising children, and finding moments of joy despite everything. They did not expect life to be comfortable or easy. They expected it to be hard, and they lived it anyway. This attitude is not about accepting injustice or failing to work for improvement. Rather, it is about recognizing that some difficulties cannot be avoided and must simply be endured. The medieval peasant could not make winter, warmer or longer days appear. They accepted what could not be changed and focused their energy on what they could control: their preparation, their choices, their responses to circumstances. Adaptability and flexibility characterized the survivors. When normal food ran out, they found alternatives. When fuel became scarce, they burned different materials or found ways to need less heat. When tools broke, they repaired them with whatever materials were available. The ability to improvise, to solve problems with limited resources, to adapt to changing circumstances, these were survival skills that kept people alive. Modern life often provides us with specialized tools and expert solutions for every problem, which is wonderful when those resources are available. But relying exclusively on perfect solutions can leave us helpless when circumstances force improvisation. The medieval peasant's approach of using what was available and making do with imperfect solutions is worth remembering. The value of traditional knowledge cannot be overstated. Medieval peasants knew things that had been learned over centuries of trial and error: which plants were edible, how to predict weather, when to plant crops, how to preserve food, how to treat illnesses. This knowledge was not written in books, but carried in memory and passed from generation to generation. It was living knowledge, constantly tested and refined through application. We live in an era of unprecedented access to information, but information is not the same as knowledge. Knowing how to find instructions online is different from having deep, practical understanding built through experience. The medieval example suggests value in learning skills thoroughly, practicing them until they become second nature, and passing them down to younger generations, not just as abstract information, but as lived competence. Acceptance of uncertainty and lack of control characterized the medieval worldview in ways that made their difficult life more bearable. They understood that they could not control whether crops succeeded or failed, whether winter would be mild or brutal, whether illness would strike or pass by. They did their best and accepted that the outcome was not entirely up to them. This attitude, often expressed through religious faith, protected them from the paralyzing anxiety that comes from feeling responsible for controlling the uncontrollable. Modern culture often promotes the illusion of control, suggesting that with enough effort and planning we can ensure specific outcomes. When things go wrong, we blame ourselves or others for failing to prevent what may have been unpreventable. The medieval approach, acknowledging that uncertainty is fundamental to existence and that doing one's best is all that can be asked, offers a healthier perspective. Finally, the simple fact that they survived teaches us something profound about human resilience. People endured conditions that seem impossible from our comfortable modern perspective. They did it not because they were superhuman, but because they were human, and humans are capable of remarkable endurance when necessary. We are descended from survivors, from people who lived through war, famine, plague, and countless winters that tested them to their limits. That strength is our inheritance, and it remains within us even if modern life rarely requires us to call upon it. Medieval winter survival was not romantic or noble in the moment. It was cold, hungry, frightening, and sometimes fatal. But it was survivable, and most years, most people survived it. They woke each morning, did what needed to be done, supported each other when possible, and kept going until spring finally arrived. And when spring came, they celebrated, planted their fields, and began preparing for the next winter, because that is what survival required and what being human means. Their story, these peasants who lived and died without fame or recognition, is worth remembering and honouring. They were not so different from us, not inferior in intelligence or capability, simply living in harder circumstances with fewer resources. What they endured and how they endured it offers both practical lessons and inspiration for anyone facing difficulty. Their example says that humans can survive more than we think possible, that preparation and community matter enormously, and that even in the darkest, coldest times, spring will eventually come. As you drift off to sleep tonight, in your warm bed, with food in your kitchen and heat at the touch of a button, spare a thought for those long-ago peasants huddled near dying fires in smoke-filled cottages, waiting for dawn and the hope of another day survived. They are our ancestors, not just genetically but spiritually, the ones who endured so that future generations could live. Their winter is long over, but their story continues in us, and in the choices we make about how to face our own challenges, different in kind but not in essence from theirs. Rest well, knowing that whatever difficulties tomorrow brings, you carry within you the strength of countless generations who faced worse and survived. The human story is a story of survival against incredible odds, and you are part of that story, heir to all the accumulated wisdom and resilience of everyone who came before. Sleep now, and let the stories of the past remind you that spring always comes, light always returns, and survival is always possible for those who refuse to give up. The wind howls across frozen fields as the sun sets early over a small medieval village, and inside homes made of wood and mud, families gather close to dying embers, preparing for the long, cold months ahead. Tonight, we journey back 700 years to discover how ordinary people endured the harshest season without modern heating, grocery stores, or any of the comforts we take for granted today. This is a story of resilience, ingenuity, and the quiet determination of those who survived when survival itself was an achievement. Before we go back in time together, if you're enjoying settling in for the night with a bit of history, consider hitting subscribe. And I'm curious, where in the world are you listening from right now? And what time is it there? Drop it in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories travel. The landscape of medieval Europe transforms dramatically as autumn fades into winter, and the peasants who work the land must shift their entire way of living to match the rhythm of the cold. Imagine standing at the edge of a village in the year 1320, somewhere in the English countryside, watching as the last golden leaves fall from the oak trees and the sky takes on that heavy grey quality that promises snow. The air smells different now, sharper and cleaner, with a metallic edge that makes your lungs work harder with each breath. Smoke rises from every cottage chimney in thin grey columns that bend and twist in the wind before disappearing into the overcast sky above. The peasants have been preparing for this moment since the harvest ended in late September. Every decision made during the warmer months was calculated with winter survival in mind, because in the Middle Ages, winter was not merely uncomfortable but genuinely dangerous. Without proper preparation, families could starve, freeze, or succumb to illness before the spring thaw finally arrived. The stakes were absolute, and everyone in the village understood this truth from the time they could walk. Let us begin by understanding who these people were and what their lives looked like before the first frost arrived. A typical medieval village contains perhaps 30 to 50 families, most of them living in small one-room cottages clustered around a central commons and a stone church. The manor house, where the lord lives, sits slightly apart on higher ground, its walls thicker and windows shuttered with actual wooden panels rather than the oiled cloth that covers peasant windows. Between the cottages lie narrow dirt paths that turn to mud whenever it rains, and beyond the village proper stretch the open fields where peasants have spent the entire growing season cultivating wheat, barley, oats, and rye. These fields now lie harvested and bare, the stubble poking through increasingly hard soil as the temperature drops week by week. Peasant daily life during autumn revolves around gathering and preserving everything that might be needed once the deep cold arrives. Women and children walk the forest edges, collecting fallen branches, acorns, and the last remaining berries. Men repair damaged tools, reinforce cottage walls with fresh daub, and slaughter animals that cannot be sustained through the lean months ahead. The rhythm of life in a medieval village follows the agricultural calendar with absolute precision, and everyone participates according to their age and ability. Children as young as 5 or 6 carry light loads of kindling, learning the skills they will need to survive as adults. Teenagers work alongside their parents in the fields and workshops, their bodies already accustomed to physical labour that would exhaust most modern people within hours. The elderly, no longer capable of heavy work, take on tasks like mending clothes, watching small children, and passing down the accumulated wisdom that makes survival possible. As October progresses into November, the tempo of activity intensifies. There is an urgency in every gesture, every conversation, every transaction at the village market. The peasants know what is coming because they have lived through it many times before, and each winter carries memories of hardship, loss, and the constant gnawing presence of cold that seeps into everything. The social structure of the village becomes even more apparent during the preparation season. The lord of the manor has the right to demand labour from his peasants, a system called corvée, but he also has a vested interest in their survival, since dead peasants cannot work his fields come spring. This creates a complex relationship where the lord might allow access to the manor's resources in exchange for additional service, or grant permission to gather more wood from his forests than would normally be permitted. The village priest serves as both spiritual guide and practical advisor, his stone church offering a glimpse of what winter will be like for those without proper shelter. During services, peasants can feel the difference that thick stone walls make, how they hold the heat from dozens of gathered bodies and keep out the worst of the wind. The priest reminds his congregation that suffering in this life brings rewards in the next, but he also quietly shares information about which families might need extra help, which elderly villagers live alone, and which children show signs of the winter sickness that kills before spring arrives. Let the snow begin to fall, soft and silent at first, dusting the thatched roofs and collecting in the corners where walls meet ground. Fortifying the home against the cold. The typical peasant cottage measures perhaps 15 feet by 20 feet, its walls built from a wooden frame filled with wattle and daub. Wattle consists of woven sticks, branches, and reeds that create a lattice structure between the timber posts. Daub is the mixture pressed into this lattice, a combination of clay, mud, straw, and animal dung that hardens into a surprisingly effective barrier against wind and weather. As winter approaches, every family inspects their walls for cracks, gaps, or places where the daub has crumbled away during the summer. Repairing these gaps becomes critical for medieval winter survival because even small openings allow precious heat to escape and icy drafts to penetrate. The process of making fresh daub is unpleasant but necessary. Clay must be dug from the riverbank and carried home in baskets, then mixed with straw from the recently harvested grain and dung from the family's animals. Children stomp the mixture with their bare feet, squishing the components together until they reach the right consistency, thick enough to cling to the wattle but wet enough to push deep into the gaps. The smell of fresh daub is earthy and organic, not particularly offensive to people accustomed to living alongside animals. Once mixed, the daub must be applied by hand, pressed firmly into every crack and smoothed as flat as possible. As it dries over the following days, it shrinks slightly, sometimes requiring a second application to achieve a complete seal. The exterior walls receive the most attention, but interior walls also get repaired because maintaining even a few degrees of extra warmth can mean the difference between comfort and misery. The roof presents its own challenges. Thatched roofs made from bundled reeds or straw provide excellent insulation when properly maintained, but they require annual inspection and repair. Over the summer, wind and rain inevitably damage portions of the thatch, creating thin spots where cold air will penetrate once winter arrives. Replacing damaged sections requires skill, and most villages have one or two individuals who specialize in this work, trading their expertise for food, labor, or other goods. A well-maintained thatched roof can be remarkably effective at keeping out rain and snow while trapping warm air inside the cottage. The thick layer of bundled plant material creates countless tiny air pockets that act as natural insulation. When fresh snow falls on a properly insulated thatched roof, it actually adds another layer of insulation rather than causing problems. The snow prevents heat from escaping upward, while its white surface reflects what little winter sunlight penetrates the grey clouds. Windows, those small openings that allow light and air into the cottage during summer, must be carefully managed as winter approaches. Only the wealthy can afford glass, so peasant windows consist of wooden shutters or frames covered with oiled cloth, animal bladder, or thin scraped horn. These materials allow some light to filter through while blocking the worst of the wind. As temperatures drop, many families choose to close their shutters entirely, accepting the resulting darkness as the price of warmth. The single doorway, usually positioned on the southern or eastern side of the cottage to avoid the prevailing winter winds, gets fitted with extra layers of protection. Heavy cloth or animal hides hang inside the door frame, creating an additional barrier against drafts. Some families construct a small exterior porch using scrap wood and thatch, creating an airlock effect that prevents cold air from